And my mic is it's this
Sounds
one,
great.
right? Okay, cool.
Yeah, sounds good.
Awesome.
Yep. So, I don't know if this is controversial or not, but I have moved over to Arc. I've embraced it.
Wow.
Ooh. I couldn't convince myself to do it.
I love
tried it for a bit.
You just got to go all in on it.
Go all in. Okay.
And then you're like, oh goodness, this is great.
Can
What's
you pull
your
over
favorite thing
all
about
your
it? So yesterday, 2 days ago, I even went in on easels, which
What's
is
that?
like there's several features that I really like. So easels, you can like basically clip pieces of a website and put it all on a like your own landing page. And so I created an easel because I was like going to all these different places to look at my vanity metrics. And I was like, I'm just going to clip all of them and put them in a single spot.
Nice.
And so it's so
Yeah.
lovely to like log in and be like, okay, here's my ConvertKit stuff. Here's my hash node stats. Here's my YouTube stats. Here's my Twitter stats. And it's like all in one place. So that's really
cool.
nice. Yeah. You can also set up different spaces. So like I have a Redwood space, I have a Advent of Code space, I have a dev space, and then I have a personal space. And so it's nice having all those shortcuts that I use in those contexts together. And you can also set up like side-by-side panes of content. So like there's a couple websites where I feel like I'm always tabbing back and forth between the two. So I just have them set up side by side
That's
to be able
really
to
neat.
look at them
Can
together.
can you crop parts of the website you want in like the
in the
website?
easel piece, the easel you can, which is
that's really neat.
Mm-hmm.
Is it essentially just like a collection of iframes that you kind of drag the height and width for?
That is a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
It's like you can make a dashboard without having to
and
code
I
anything.
like that they are trying to think about the browser in a different way. And it's like the browser's been around for how many years? And to think about something differently is really interesting. And they even just their marketing plan. I was watching their YouTube video last night about their new releases. And I love that they're like, this is the new feature. Thank you. And then they named the developer that contributed to it, which is just like a really nice touch. So, and then I was trying to think some of the other really nice things that they have. It just looks good.
That's cool.
That's important. Oh, Boost. So there is, we're going to have some ConvertKit people on the podcast in a few weeks. I'm going to talk to them about this. But when I'm tagging users in ConvertKit, I use these really long tags. And so it like busts out the column that they're in. And so everything wraps and it looks disgusting. And it's hard to like just scan through the list. And so in Chrome, I use some extension or whatever to override the CSS just on the ConvertKit site. But like Arc has that built in. It's called Boost. And you can basically write code or modify the look of almost any page, which is really cool. Yeah, that you can just be like, I'm going to change all these things.
And do you have to? Do they do the like the targeting for you in terms of like the?
Like you can just click on it and it'll help you find stuff. They do have like a WYSIWYG if you're like, I'm just going to use these fonts. But like for me, where I'm like, I can write code and I can write the CSS, I can do all that targeting in it. It's a very good feeling.
That's cool.
Yeah,
that's cool. I'll have to check it out. I'm a Safari man myself. I use Chrome for development, but I try to use Safari for as much as I possibly can. So I like the minimalism. It's pretty fast. Yeah. They have some weird things to it, like the videos. Sometimes they throttle them in certain ways, probably like Safari privacy stuff. So, but I like the integration with iPhone. I like all my passwords and iCloud keychain. I'm like a defaults guy. I try to do as much.
You and Brad.
I do some things like I'm a Vim dude, but as far as like tools these days, notes, messages, FaceTime.
I want to have this conversation with both of you.
Yeah, because
it's the water's warm. It's wonderful. Apple Music, HomePod. Like I am in the walled garden.
Oh, HomePod, you're all in.
All in.
I'm the exact same, and I got to a point where I was fighting my setup too much.
Yeah,
and then I switched from Android to Apple and then just went defaults with everything. And it worked out so well. And I don't think I'll ever look back. Although I'm still a Chrome guy just because I haven't moved my passwords over. As soon as I get all that out of there and all bookmarks.
Your passwords right in Chrome?
Yeah, because that was like a long history.
Because it's a default?
Because I never used a password manager, and so it was always right in the browser. But now they've got like you said, Apple's got the sync for everything.
They have the iCloud keychain, and it's gotten a lot better than the last OS update. So I use 1Password because I used that when it first came out. But then I started using the iOS keychain stuff, which is great when you're on your phone or whatever. It's all there, right? Yeah. And Apple actually has an official keychain Chrome extension. So I'm on the now I'm going to leave 1Password. Once I get them all into iCloud, then I'm done. It's a little clunky. You have to like authenticate it every time you open Chrome, but once you do, it works out pretty well. And it can even save I don't know if it can save passwords. It can't save new passwords, but it's nice because then I just have one place to look. The other day I was me and Ryan were at the bank, and we were like changing our business name because we used to be called something else. I had to log into Dropbox to find our like incorporate. Auth is just still so crazy and so bad. Yep. I had to open Dropbox on my phone. I had to sign in. I had to remember which email I used. I used the wrong one. I go to Google. Which Google account is it? Oh, that one changed. And then you have to look up the one right? Anyway. So I always try to simplify that stuff, but it's still, I'm interested in the passkey stuff that are coming out and if that's going to help.
We had a big conversation about that last episode, and
interesting.
There's still a lot of open questions in our minds, just from a user perspective. I don't think we have the education to know if we feel like it's as secure as we would want it. Because the baseline question was, what if your phone's at the bottom of a lake? Then what happens? Right? Because it's all supposedly
on device. Interesting.
Yeah.
It's tough with this stuff because I even use the sign in with Apple thing now too, which is probably even like more savage for a lot of developers to think about being a programmer and just clicking continue with Apple. But I love it when it works. And I was like, this is all I want to do, for everything. I just want it to say, boom, and you press a button. Since I have my phone, I am Sam. Sam, I am. That's it. That's all you need to know.
Yeah.
And then they can figure it out from there. But the problem is all these things that they've come out with have to work with the existing solutions. So it's just grown up over time. And so, it'd be nice if they could start fresh, but that's never how it is, right?
Yeah. Amy, what do you think? Kick it off?
Let's do it.
Awesome.
Okay. I can run with it. Give me a second. I got to get the music.
Oh yeah. I can't forget the music.
It'll be James's contribution, even though he's not here. There it is. Okay.
Yeah, I was bummed not to meet him either. I've talked to him a few times online, but maybe we'll do it again sometime.
Yes, for sure. All right. I'm trying to think, how does he start this? He goes, what's up? Mine is hello. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Compressed FM, a podcast all about web design and development with a little bit of zest. Today, we are joined by Sam, and we will be talking about all things UI development in 2024.
Web development and design, who would have guessed? Well, we can do them both, even add a little zest. So turn up the volume, get ready for the best. Let's get it started in this episode of Compressed.
Hello, my name is Amy Dutton, and I am a lead maintainer on the Redwood.js core team. And I have with me my other co-host, bradgarropy.
Hey, y'all. I'm bradgarropy. I'm a front-end developer at Atlassian working on Confluence.
And Sam is our special guest for today. Welcome, Sam.
Hey, how's it going? I'm Sam Selikoff, and I run BuildDry.com. Awesome to be here.
You released a course recently, right? Or you've been making all kinds of things?
Yep. It's we have a bunch of courses on the site, and we just released Remix, Ship an App with Remix, it's called. Oh. And it's a really cool one. It's a fun one. And we're working on a new one about Radix, which fits into our conversation today. So we could definitely talk about that.
Very nice.
I have something that came up yesterday. This will be fun. This is like totally on topic with UI development. It's like nitty gritty details. And it's something that I realized that I have an opinion about, but I'm not sure if it's the right opinion. So I was working with someone that was building out a component library, and they pulled up Radix. Well, we were talking about Shad, which uses Radix. And I think Catalyst with the new Tailwind UI is going this direction as well, where say you have a like radio group where you have a radio button with a heading and some sub content underneath, and it's all styled really nicely. And in order to get that formatting, instead of saying like, div class equals whatever, you've kind of abstracted those things into these components where you say like radio group, and that's your tag. And then inside it's like radio group item, and then inside heading, and then it's like description or whatever. So it's very semantic. You look at it and you're like, okay, this is kind of custom HTML. So that's one approach. The other approach that I found that I typically lean to, and I'm curious what your preference is that I'm like, I'm just going to have a component. I'm going to throw data at it and it figures out what to do. And I don't worry about from a component standpoint of, I've got to get all my semantics right. I've got to remember how to do this. And the nice thing is if you're using like say TypeScript, it'll make inferences and you can just in VS Code, hit command period, add my missing attributes, and it'll kind of help me along as I'm writing that. And I don't have to remember all these custom things that have been built. Does that make sense?
Yep. So you're working on basically a reusable component for an app and a team.
Yep.
And the question is, what should the external interface be for other people,
super
other developers
gritty
to use?
But very relevant to what I worked on yesterday.
This is bread and butter stuff. I mean, this is what people run into. So it's a great way to tee up the conversation, I think. So yeah, the UI libraries like Radix and Headless UI and ARIA components are awesome. I mean, if you've been doing this stuff for 5 years, before they existed, it was just Ryan Florence has this talk called The Curse of React, where he says the curse of React is that it made it so easy to build custom stuff that you just dive in and start building it, and you end up with stuff that was worse than the shared like jQuery UI component libraries we used to use, because you don't know everything that you're not building. So the radio group is a great example. One of our videos in the course is going to be like the Apple selector group. So when you check out on a Mac and you choose the different options for the space and the hard drive and all that stuff and the price changes, if you ask a React developer to build that, sure, no problem. 3 buttons with each option, on click, set active option, boom, you're done. And then add some styling. But when you take a look at the site on Apple, you start to notice, oh, there's some cool stuff here. Like the arrow keys go up and down, and they even cycle. So if you hold down, 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 it goes back to the beginning. If you have the first option in a group selected and then you hit tab, instead of tabbing through each button, it tabs to the next form group. And your custom buttons don't do that, right? Tabbing would go through each button and all that stuff. And it turns out that those are all the accessibility kind of characteristics, the features of a native radio group. And so when that Curse of React talk came out, it's like, really, this is a radio group, actually. And sometimes it's hard to that can be the hardest part. What am I making? Is it, it's actually just a checkbox, even though it looks fancy, right? But all of these headless UI libraries let you do both. It's the best of both worlds, where you get to do all of the however markup you want, like in your example or in the Apple example, but you wrap them in these Radix primitives, because that gives you exactly the same behavior as a native input type radio, except it's a lot easier to style because it's unstyled. So to me, at the level, once you talk about how to share that's like a separate conversation, and all of those details shouldn't matter at all. Those are like implementation details. And then those bring the behavior of a checkbox or a radio group or a modal or a drop down or whatever. The styling, how you do it, is up to you. But then how you expose it to reuse it is a separate question. And so we see this a lot where people do kind of the first thing you're saying, which is, oh, we're using Radix, so here's how you make a selector group with Radix. And then that everywhere. But Radix is at the lowest level. It's just enough to give you the behavior, but it's not really solving the reusability problem and the encapsulation problem, which is the whole point of a design system, right? A design system it exists because we want a stricter interface so that we can ensure some amount of consistency across the app. And it makes it easy for us, the people working on the design system components, to update without breaking all the usages. So this is really like a tough question, but when I start, I wait until the duplication becomes a problem. And then it's like, I want this button to look the same. I want the selector group to look the same. We're going to go with like maximally restricted interface. So even if under the hood that radio group has radix.group, radix.item, radix.description, my public interface is going to be like, selector group, and it takes in maybe like a JSON of items. Like you said, it's a TypeScript prop that says items. These are an array of objects with ID and option and value, something like that. And that's it, because anything else you expose as a prop to customize that a developer is going to use, and they will use everything you expose, you're not really rendering the selector group anymore. If they change it so much, you now have you almost have two different components, and again, that restricts your ability to change it and update it in the future. So I think it's a hard question, because it's kind of these high level design principles of how restricted is the interface. But you also want some flexibility, because if somebody runs into something you hadn't thought of, maybe you want that to be a conversation. But I think those are two separate things. And I think people shouldn't be afraid to really lock it down when it comes to making things that are reusable.
I love that answer, because it's like, yes. Which one? Yes.
I want to take a bit of the beginning of that conversation and try to use it as a segue here into another conversation I really wanted to have with you, Sam. So we talked about how Radix UI really provides the primitives for native HTML form controls, right? Radio groups, checkboxes, select buttons. And, although they never went anywhere, I feel like native HTML form controls are making a comeback in a big way with now the advent of Next.js and Remix kind of using these as primitives to send form actions, right? That's what they're using in actions and server actions to get that data across to the server. And I wanted to use this as a jumping off point for talking about Remix and Next and their differences, their similarities, because I went to a meetup and really dove into Next 14 the other night. And I reached a conclusion. I saw this whole demo, and at the end of the demo, they were showing how like server actions or server components with suspense can help. But the demo to me, essentially, at the end of it all, looked like a client rendered application. Each individual component had a spinner and then populated with data when the data came in. And so I was trying to understand the true benefit of these server components and server actions at the end of the day, because it felt like a client rendered app, although the developer experience got a whole lot better, given that you can encapsulate all your server logic right into a React component, essentially. So all that background being said, I'm really curious to kind of maybe dive into some similarities and differences between Next 14 and the server concepts that they have in comparison to something like, let's say, Remix.
Cool. Yeah, I think as far as the original point about the form data stuff, totally agree. And we helped build, me and Ryan helped the guys at Tailwind build out headlessui.dev, their website for their headless UI library. And this was a couple of years ago when it first went up. And I remember when Remix was kind of getting built, Ryan Florence reached out and was like, hey, we want to use, Switch or one of these components that doesn't render a native input into the form. And in Remix, you submit a form, and let the browser serialize it. So the browser knows how to serialize a form element and input elements. And that's an awesome model. And because of the curse of React, and because we spent so much time on the client, people didn't really think about that, because they're just like, I want to do on submit, and I have the data in React state, and then I just send it to my API endpoint. So why do I need a form element? And in that case, maybe you didn't. But it's cool. Again, just fast forwarding to today, all three of those main UI libraries all render input. So the Radix selector group that I used for the Apple demo, you just look and there's a hidden radio. And the value is bound, and that's true for all their components. And it's really cool. Even their slider, I made this slider, in iOS music, when you kind of hover on the volume and it grows and then you can let go. that's another video in the course. It's really cool. Radix does so much of the little stuff for you, handling keyboard shortcuts and stuff, but it still has a input type progress with the value. So you can just log the form data or get it on your server and you're just done. And it's awesome.
Yeah.
So I think Remix did a really good job here moving the ecosystem in this direction, because that was one of the original pieces of their framework that I felt was really cohesive. I haven't used Redwood. I know they also have both pieces. I don't know. I think they use GraphQL at the beginning.
That's right.
But they're talking about using server components soon, which is exciting. And so I think Remix was the first, at least for me, and a lot of the folks I saw pushing this. But now it's really nice that we're getting back to this because the browser does do a lot. And originally the tension was like, I want to make this fancy component. HTML doesn't support this, so I have to write JavaScript. But now we're figuring out ways to disentangle so we can have both. So yeah, these days you have Remix and you have Next 14 with the app directory, both using form data as the main interface, the main transport way to transport data from a client to the server. And
now that's also a good point to drill into here as well, because I also think that a lot of people using raw form data now are having a bit of a rude awakening with our TypeScript centralized world, being like, oh, dang, this is all untyped because it has to get serialized. You know, how do we handle serializing this on the client, sending it over to the server, and then unwrapping that and making sure the types are all the same? So we see things like Zod coming in to do this kind of runtime checking, but it still is a bit of a friction point at the end of the day, right? The web doesn't have a great answer for that, keeping those types across the wire.
Definitely a friction point. And yeah, form data is not typed at the protocol level. So like the browser wouldn't reject, it can't make a GET request for like typed data, right?
Yeah.
And so it's just going to get whatever's in the response body. So and same with an API server, it's getting a request to create a user, and it can't say I need a type with a key name and the value has to be string. So if you send over something, you'll just get that taken care of. Now, the frameworks and even React itself are starting to add some of this stuff. So for example, with server actions, I think I'm trying to remember, but basically using form data, again, it's kind of back to our Radix conversation where it's a lower level API. Form data is a little bit clunky to work with, especially compared to some of the nice form libraries in the React ecosystem. But over time, if it's standardized and especially integrated at the React level, which it is with server actions, then you can imagine them doing a lot more of that kind of thing. For example, they do serialize values that are going to be passed as arguments. So if you have a server component that renders a server action, or even you pass it to a client action and it has like a variable as an argument, maybe it's closed over something in the scope of the component, React will actually serialize it so that it's in the DOM. So that by the time the browser renders it and someone clicks on it, let's say it has user ID 1 for updating that user, you don't have to think about that. And that value is going to be what it was on the server. And that's a nice part. Now, when you submit it, of course, anyone could submit anything to your endpoint. And that's the interesting thing about server actions is that they're basically like ad hoc API endpoints.
Yeah.
So you still have to validate them there. But yes, the tooling is not as integrated as it could be, but the serialization boundary is real and it always has been. So there's other times where people have projects that says TypeScript says this is going to be a first name that's a string, but it's actually not true. It's a lie because it's coming from the client and you could change the data and submit a new request. So whenever you go through this layer where you serialize and deserialize, you need some validation at runtime to make sure the data looks like it does. So TypeScript can't really help there, but libraries like Zod can do the runtime check and then give you the type data so that you as a coder only have to worry about the happy path. You throw an error if it's messed up. That way, if you make a mistake on your program on the front end, you get it. Or if anyone sends something there that you didn't expect, they just get an error. So I think that'll get a lot better. But I think now that we have things like server actions and server components at the React level that all these frameworks use, it's going to set the stage for much nicer abstractions to come.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, getting into like the end result of, I guess, what I saw when it came down to a server component. Right, a server component from what I understand, and I'm still coming up to speed on some of this stuff, is like it's a suspense boundary, right? And the server component just knows that there's data coming in and it's rendering a suspense fallback until it's there. And that server component somehow has thanks to the magic of a bundler, maybe a endpoint to access it. Is that right?
So I think the easiest way to think about it is, and also if the demo at the end of it had kind of spinners that resembled what you'd see in the SPA in the client rendered React app, I think that's not the best example that showcases the benefits of the architecture. So I think the easiest
is very tactful.
No, I mean, it's cool that you can upgrade to that, but if that's what we were already doing, right? It doesn't.
Yeah.
That's what we were already doing.
It doesn't motivate the technology. So I think the easiest way to think about it, did you ever write PHP or any server-side framework?
Not like, I mean, I rendered templates through an Express app,
Okay, there you go.
Yeah.
So if you have an Express app and you make a request to the index page, in Express, JavaScript is like, it's like synchronous.
Yeah.
It's not actually, but it basically is.
Yeah.
So, when we run JavaScript in the browser, it's asynchronous because we can't block the UI thread. You can't submit a form and then lock the user's computer or whatever, make the mouse not work. So we have, a loop and all this stuff. But in the server, for HTTP servers, it's always synchronous. So your Express route handler would look at, okay, await, get the request to the home page. Okay, let's go get the template that renders the home page. Well, first, actually, let's get the request. Let's get the data from the database. Let's say all the users. So I'm going to get a handle to the database or make an API request to a service or something. So await db.getUsers. Now I have the template and I can it's compiled or whatever. And I can say template.render, pass in the users. And then that's going to give you HTML as a string.
Yep.
And then the last line of that handler is going to return it as a HTTP response with that string. It's all HTML. So if you just had a purely server-side rendered Express app, that's what would happen. And the steps there are just happening one after the other. There's no callbacks or anything like that. So that's how PHP works. That's how Rails, like Ruby on Rails, works. Like any purely server-side rendered setup that's what it's doing. And that's the way to think about React server components.
Yeah. And it's each server component is its own mini little endpoint. Are they?
No.
It's one app.
So just like you're an Express app, when you make a request, you route it to a handler. That's the way to think about this. So you make a request, because we're not talking about server actions right now. We're just talking about server components. So server components render. Server components are like the async component that you await stuff in. So mostly for the most of the up until now, React has only had components that are not async. They're just functions or classes, right? But you can't await in a component. And this is, again, for the reason we talked about. Because when you're in the browser, in the UI, you can't ever stop. React always has to know what frame, there's a frame being rendered. If you make an update, what's the frame? And if we're awaiting something, we have to say, okay, what's the frame while we're waiting? We'll render a spinner. But in the server, it's not like that. In the server, you make a request and you can't do anything while you're waiting for the database to return the data. You can't do anything while you're waiting for the template to compile. And so you just await. So that's a server component. It's an async function component, and it can await things. And it runs on the server and only on the server. That's the other thing. It doesn't ever re-render the way React components in the client do, which is why there's no state. It's request response. So you think about it, whether you're doing in Next 14, you think about it, a request comes in, the framework is going to route it to the right page based on the conventions of the page router, and then it's just going to run through those steps. Just that's how to think about it. Await, render, and then it's going to return. Just think about it like the HTML. It just returns the HTML. And there's React server component frameworks that do this. They don't have any client-side JavaScript. And that would be very similar to your Express example. So that's like the first layer, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so in that case, what happens on the client while the server component is rendering, right?
It's the same thing that happens if you visit your Express app. You see a browser loading spinner.
Can't server components be nested though, right? You could render a static shell and then you've got a server component in the static shell.
Yes.
That's where you wrap a server component in suspense, let's say, right? That's how you have the...
Yeah, so we can talk about suspense because that's like a layer on top.
Sure.
This is like the first layer.
Gotcha.
So that's kind of the way I think about the primitive itself. And what's cool about it is that we've never been able to do this before, right? React has never had a way for us to fetch data inside of a component.
Right.
People have made libraries that use effect or do different things.
Right.
Or frameworks like Next have added hooks like get server-side props that effectively do a very similar thing, right? Because get server-side props is also running the server, so it's just boom, 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 one after another. You can use await in it, right? But now we can do it in the component, which is cool because components are composable. So
now you have one component that's like the buy button, and it's completely hooked up, right? Because every bit of code that it runs on the server. It's all encapsulated, and you can stick that anywhere, right?
Exactly. That's like one of the main benefits. So
good DX. Getting back to the client experience, what happens on the client in the meantime, I guess.
Yeah. And it's more than just about DX, but yeah. So you could think about it as sending HTML, but we want to be able to write client-side code too. We want to be able to use state. We want to be able to use radix, all these cool things. So what Next actually does is not just sends HTML. It also sends a client bundle that includes any client code you may have written. And so at the beginning, if you just write a server component in like the root index page, there is no client.
Right. It's going to render like a server rendered app, right? It's going to do the thing, get the response, done. Right.
Exactly. And so there is no kind of React on the client. Now there actually is, because like links want to be able to only render children and all that stuff. But just to think about it, that's the way to do it. And then also to your point, you could have the page can fetch data, but it can also render components that fetch data. So you could drop in, Amy's example of the dashboard. Let's say all those different things were wrapped up. Let's say that she had a component that was like an iframe component. It took in a source for the page that she wanted, and it had a callback on it that said when it was done loading. You could drop in 4 of those iframes in a CSS grid, and they would all just load together. And it would just be like the Express server app where you click on it, you just see the browser loading spinner. It's a white screen, and then it all comes back up at once. And then this is where suspense comes in. So you say, we don't want to do a full blocking thing. It's nice that we start there because that kind of, it raises the floor because we have server rendered HTML, which is good for all sorts of reasons.
Right.
But now we want to show the heading, and then we want to show like
your app shell
or something.
Yeah.
Exactly, your app shell. So you can wrap all of those things in suspense. And because of streaming, it's not shipping it to the client. It's not doing data fetching on the client. What happens is the first request gets a response faster, because when React tries to render that server component tree and it sees a suspense boundary, one of those components suspend, the suspense boundary, the fallback, is going to return immediately. So now it has an answer for what to render here. It's the fallback of the component, which could be like a spinner. It returns that. And then while those components are awaiting, eventually they finish, and React knows now they're done. We can replace the fallback with their content. And it actually streams an update. This is really cool. It's like HTML streaming, because the browser spinner will continue to be going as if it was waiting on a longer request, but you'll see the page update. So and again, still no client-side data fetching, no set state, no rent, none of that stuff.
Right. So, so some developer benefits here. Number one, you're not managing loading state on the client and making those decisions yourself about what to render as fallbacks. That's now React's job, right? Suspense handles that. Server components handle that. The user benefits at this point is, all I can see so far is less round trips. So instead of reinitiating data requests from the client in a use effect or something like that, you only had to send one, and then as things finish, data updates are streamed in. That's probably a win, right? It's probably the same bytes over the wire.
So it'll be It'll be less bytes over the wire, and it should be a lot faster, because if you hear people talking about waterfalls, this is what they mean. So
yes.
when let's say you just have a client-side rendered SPA, a React app, you have to fetch it and then render
the whole thing, and then
until you run those effects, because the effects don't run until after render, right?
Okay,
so
yes.
You've gone back and forth, and this is the thing, that your server that's doing the rendering is probably a lot closer to your database. At the least, you have more control over it. You don't have to wait. So you can just fetch the data right away and update it. But it's also more than that. It's less bytes over the wire, because remember, you're not having to send the code from that index page to render. You're not calling render. Again, React is calling render, but the version that gets sent from the back end, it's like an RSC payload, and you can think of that as just the result of the function. So in the component, you have a handle of the database, you get the users, and then you return JSX, right? You return like users.map and then render an LI. Think of that return JSX as that's what's called the RSC payload. That's what is getting sent to the front end, because that's the only thing the front end actually needs in order to update the UI. It doesn't need the database, because that only runs on the server. It doesn't need the users or any transforms you do. Once that component executes and you get the JSX tree and they serialize it, they send it to the front end. And that's going to be a lot less than having, again, not only to wait to actually start the app until you know what to fetch, but to even execute the function. You don't execute the function on the client. You just use the return value to update the UI.
Okay, so I'm seeing some performance gains, right? Less going on because of the streaming, shifting more work towards a server. Let's talk about like the loading story, because that was another place where I think I need some clarification on benefits.
Stick something in though. Is it more performant right now?
Well, it depends on what you mean by that.
Yeah, so this is just like Twitter speak, and I know that you have to separate Twitter speak from reality sometimes. But like just the Twitter chatter that I hear sometimes is like it's not as performant yet as it should be, or that it's been promised.
Yeah, it really depends, because we're really talking about like the RSC architecture, I would say, which today Next.js has like the most, I guess, mature version of it, but even that is still new. And they also you also have to separate the things that are inherent to RSC versus the opinions that Next has layered on, because they have a more opinionated way that they want to build and deploy apps, which also involves their serverless offering, which has implications for some APIs in Next. So the serverless thing, you have a cold start. And so now if you're rendering at request time, a lot of the Next.js push in the couple years before this had a lot to do with SSG, because they can put it on a CDN and cache it, and you don't have to run it at request time.
Yeah.
Again, because serverless is simpler, but it has a cold start. Now that we're doing more stuff at runtime, at request time on the server, the cold start can make it feel really bad and not like a good fit. And it has nothing to do with the architecture. So you could say, yes, that's slower in that dimension, but it's faster in others. Let's say you have a blog and you want to do syntax highlighting on it, right? Yeah. And today, maybe you do client stuff. And
speaking to me right now. I'm rewriting it as we speak.
Server components are amazing for this, because today, what would you do? You have to ship the whole markdown parsing and formatting library, the syntax highlighter client lib to the front end, and all the languages you might ever use. And you have to wait for the browser to load the syntax highlighter and render it. And your users just wanting to see static HTML. They're not interacting with it. So you don't need that code running the way you need the code running for a user to interact with a dropdown or a toggle, right? Those are client features. Like those are things that you want the browser to run, because they need to respond to user interaction. But a syntax highlighted blog post is just read only. Yeah. So server components let you do all of that on a server. And then again, think about it. You're importing markdown parser, importing syntax. None of those imports get to the browser, because it runs the code and it returns the JSX with all the markup. And that is the only thing that gets sent. So that would be more performant in some dimensions, compared to doing it on the client. So that's how I would answer the performance thing. I think it's early days. It's hard to make like a black and white comparison right now between anything. As always, it kind of depends. But I think the RSCs are kind of like a new primitive, And the goal is not to have one way to do it. It's to give people more flexibility to, twist and pull levers, Ryan likes to say, from Remix. And so, yes, I would, that's kind of how I would say that. But it's good that all this stuff is coming to React, right? These are, and Next is awesome, by the way. I love Next. Like, and I use it. Build UI is a Next site right now, and it's really powerful. The bundling thing, we haven't even talked about the client features, how they actually get there, but that's a big part of what Next does, and what Redwood and Remix will do, when they adopt it. But these are new primitives at the React level. And so I think we're going to see a lot of new abstractions and different ways of doing it. So basically, you can't say, is RSC faster than an SPA? It's kind of like, it's not a well-framed question, I guess, is how I would answer that.
You're so good at these depends answers, because you can also layer in like the server and where it's stationed and all the things. Yeah. There's always those variables.
Right.
So then how does the loading states differ between a traditional client rendered app and, let's say, multiple streamed in server components?
So I guess the loading states for something you might be thinking of, like an SPA, like a pure kind of create Next app, create React app.
Yeah, like think like skeleton UI rendering
right.
in a SPA versus handling, let's say, multiple server components during the time where the result has not yet been streamed in. Yeah.
Right. I guess, suspense is the way you do that. So suspense is the way that you're supposed to coordinate that. That's actually how you do it today in Remix as well. Even though today Remix runs your whole app on the server and on the client. So in the Markdown case, you would run the Markdown component on the server to pre-render. So it's pre-rendered HTML. So the first render is HTML. But then you'd also run it again on the client, which, again, one of the reasons they're interested in adding RSC is because you could just put that as an RSC and never need to run it on the client, because you don't need to, because there's no interaction.
Sure.
But as far as loading goes, suspense works. That's how suspense works. So suspense, and this is why server components are so cool, because, again, before this, let's say you use React Query or SWR to fetch data, right? If you install a Stripe library, and it has a component, and you have like an is loading flag from your use query hook that's running in your client app, and now you add Stripe to your tree, like a checkout button. But for that to work, it needs to load something.
Yep.
You have to wire that up and add that.
Yep.
You can't slot it in and have it communicate with your data fetching APIs automatically and say, now I need to wait for this to load too before I can show the button. This is what's so cool about suspense. That's the point of suspense.
Yeah.
Suspense says any render attempt that throws a promise is going to tell the nearest boundary, you're not ready yet. And so let's render the fallback. And then once the promise resolves, re-render, and now we can show it. So this is the composability argument, which is really cool. If you think about it, let's say you had a page and you have like a chat widget you want to add, like an intercom. You can just add that. Someone made it on your team. So your boss says, add it to this page. You drop it in your tree, and it doesn't disrupt any of the loading states that you had before. It doesn't add a spinner. It does it all in the same way because of the suspense boundaries. So this is why it's exciting that basically data fetching for suspense kind of ended up as a React server component, because that's kind of the React team's answer for how to wrap the data fetching in the component boundary so that you can add things to React trees and have it work with all of the loading and the suspense boundaries that you already have, and do it in a way that every framework can use, so they don't have to have framework specific APIs, use query, use SWR, get server-side props. All that stuff goes away. And now you can install a package from NPM and have it play the same, because they all load data the same way. So that's how it works. And with Next today with streaming, you click a link and it starts streaming in the response. So the streaming thing is a cool way that you can get the fallback states, which is effectively like the shell or the skeleton screen first. But again, it's being rendered on the server. And so you don't have to wait to render to get effect or something to see. So that's fast. But that's how it all works. Yeah.
Sweet. Okay. So the moral of the story is all this stuff is complicated enough to motivate you to start a business, right? Teaching some of this stuff.
Yeah. And I think right now is like probably the hardest time to learn this stuff because it's new. And but I strongly believe, just like hooks when they first came out, when hooks first came out and you had to learn how to write use effect, it was very confusing. Like, and it still is. You write use effect, you had like a component did mount where you fetch data and then set state and render. That's very easy. When you first start writing use effects, you're like, why is my component hitting my API endpoint like 100 times in a loop? It doesn't make sense. But today we can install, use window width and just run it, and we get the window width. We can install radix dialog and render it, and because it can like use a portal and it can use the screen dimensions, it can do collision detection for us.
Right.
All of the cool hooks that we get to use and all the components are now simpler, but there was a period where they were more complicated. It was because hooks was a primitive we had missed. Even with use SWR, have you guys ever used SWR before? You just get to drop use SWR in a component. It automatically has a cache, a global cache that it remembers and refreshes queries when you focus the browser. That's because of the hooks abstraction, because you can share data without rendering. So hooks was a missing primitive in React. And flash forward 5 years, we have much easier to use things. Radix is easier to use than making up anything that you could do with it before. So today we're at year 1 of server components. But if you flash forward, I think it's going to be the simplest thing to render a list of users from a database in a table and have a form that creates a new user, basically recreating PHP MyAdmin. That to me, that's like a really good smell test, right? Because PHP MyAdmin is a complete app, right? And it has a database. It doesn't assume, API server somewhere, right? Somebody React tutorials over the last 10 years been like, and here we just call the API. It's like, where's the API? Like, are you gonna make it for me? My app doesn't work without that, right? But with server components and server actions, I think that it's going to be very compelling, that kind of hello world of building a database-driven UI.
Yeah.
Something like a PHP MyAdmin where you connect to a database and you render users. The code's going to look awesome. I mean, it already does today, but you have to know this stuff. And then what's amazing is that you can add in all of the rich client-side features you want without leaving the programming model. You're already writing React. You can drop in anything from Radix or Headless UI or any of these awesome libraries we have in the ecosystem, and you're still writing one app. But now you get to pick and choose the server-only parts, the client-only parts, the shared parts, and that's really the vision for the whole thing. So I would say we're in year 1, and so if you're adventurous, you can have a lot of fun with it. But in a couple of years' time, I think it's going to be awesome.
That's a really good point, because I really do believe that open source projects and just code in general really lives or dies by the documentation and the community around it. And so, there was a difficult point in my mind in learning React a couple years ago when people were transitioning from these class components to these functional components. And it's like half the documentation you'd read would be class components. And then it's like you also have to list out your constructors and, register all your functions, and other places that were saying, no, do this. And it was hard to know what is the right way, what's the most recent way, and like, what do I want to do moving forward? And so I think, we're kind of in that land right now with React Server Components. They're trying to figure out what's the best thing to do. And people are still trying to figure that out. And I also like that you made a differentiation between Next's implementation of React Server Components and React Server Components itself.
Yep. And Remix's implementation and Redwood's implementation are all going to look different. But they are all going to play with the same primitives play well together, so that if Stripe releases a Stripe checkout button that supports React Server Components and Server Actions in any one of those apps, you'll be able to install it, drop it in your tree. You're not going to have to set anything else up. That's incredible. Like you are not going to have to create an API route, figure out how to get it to talk to it, because it's all bundled. And that's the server actions part, which we didn't really get into, but it's the same idea. Both server actions and server components let you carry around the server code with the component, so that if you've ever worked on a Next app where you had to oh, we need this on this other screen. Let's copy it. Oh, wait, we have to copy get server-side props as well.
Right.
So if you've ever done that, right, then, oh, this page wasn't fetching the current user. I've got to copy that over as well. Now you can have a current user component that knows how to fetch the current user, and it comes with the component, and it comes with it in not a way that only works if you're using React Query or only works if you're using SWR. It works in any React app that supports server components. So that's a dream.
Yep. But we have an example right now with some of the experimental stuff we're doing with React server components, where, have you heard of Fixie AI? It's like a way of using JavaScript and AI together. They're kind of doing some interesting things, but they have a React server component that creates a chat bot with Next, and we are able to just port that over into Redwood and use it on a Redwood project.
That's awesome. And you didn't have to set up any backend stuff.
I haven't done it. I just like I just know that's what the demo's doing.
That's a dream. Or like your component system you're talking about. Let's say you have a drop down and you have to choose a country, and the countries come from a database. Your drop down component could have the query in it. And so if I drop it into my form, and I've spent a lot of time making a nice loading state for my form that says it has a single loader and then it all fades in, I add your component, which depends on data, and it still works. It doesn't disrupt that. It composes with it. Or even a domain specific component. You have to drop down in your component system that selects like the users, like all the users of the company. And so it makes a query based on the current user to your backend. Again, you can bundle that inside of the user selector component. So all your developers in your team can just render user selector, slim interface, and they're going to get the same thing, but it's going to fetch data. They don't have to know how to set that up. It's pretty cool stuff.
This makes me think of, so Brad and I have had several conversations about how, like, at Atlassian, you're talking about an enterprise company where you have different problems than the Twitter sphere, sphere that we were talking about. The indie hacker that's just trying to put something together.
They have a real company, like a capital R, real company.
That makes money. That makes money. That's the other thing that gets me. You have so many startups that don't even make money.
It feels like a lot of these small projects on Twitter are much better organized than what's going on at Atlassian sometimes.
But like, they don't make money. Legacy code. Well, and you have legacy code that you're working with. And like when I was at Zeal, we even had companies that we did stuff for that were running jQuery and CoffeeScript. And it's like, what in the world? Like, welcome to 2023 or 2024. But I can see implications for React server components, because you can have your remix project that your team is working on and a next project that a different team is working on, and you can still share components. That's like huge.
100%. Absolutely. I mean, that's what Radix and React ARIA components and headless UI, I use those on every React project, and most people do. It doesn't matter if you're using Remix or not. And because those have used all of the features that have come to React, like portals and effects that let them subscribe and unsubscribe to events to add event listeners. They use React State. All of those things now live inside the component boundary, so that libraries like Radix can exist. And that I can use Radix dropdown on any React project, because it separated those two pieces together, right? Apart. Server components, server actions do the same thing. So look in your app, anywhere you write server code, and think about what could be teased out. Whether you're talking to Prisma and you want to know how to get data from it, or you're talking to Stripe or AWS or a CMS, right? Those all look different in every framework, but you can imagine a CMS that was built for server components and server actions giving you server components that automatically fetch the data.
Or whatever,
and a form that lets you update the data in Contentful just by rendering a Contentful input with an ID from the URL, and it has a save button, and when you click save, it does a spinner. All that is in the component, and it's from their NPM library. And it composes with your loading states, whether you're in Remix or Next or Redwood. And it all works, composed with your error boundaries, because these things are errors. So the frameworks are going to become smaller and smaller, because React is doing more now, just like frameworks don't need to solve the problems that Radix is solving, and Radix can be used across all frameworks. So that's the hope, and I think that's where we're headed. But yeah, just to answer your question, so we started a company. We actually it's our second company. We used to teach Ember. That's kind of how I cut my teeth on.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, our first website was embermap.com. We still have our videos up there and still have people who watch them actually. But Build UI is kind of more broad, and it uses kind of the current stuff that we're excited about. So React, Tailwind, and server components, and Remix, and now Radix. So always stuff to teach. Love teaching. Been teaching for a long time. Trainings and all sorts of things. But that's our number one focus. That's our only focus right now. So buildui.com. We have like a newsletter route, buildui.com/newsletter, just to see everything we're doing, because I do YouTube videos. We have a podcast, and so that's kind of how to keep up with what we're doing there. So
I know we're getting close on time.
Oh, I'm good on time.
I'll just try and keep my comments short. We'll see if it ends up going somewhere. But
so I'm making a design system from scratch.
I just wanted to compliment you though, because as a person with a design background, your attention to detail is very impressive. And
thank you.
Yeah, and it really shows in the work that you do and how you teach. Because I feel like, a lot of times, especially if you're working with junior developers, that's a skill that it takes a while to develop the eye for, to say like this, even this interaction, because it's one thing to do the front end development on it. It's another piece to bring in that implementation detail. With some of the tutorials you've done with Framer, it's all very quality. So all that's to say, go check out buildui.com.
Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. And I know we didn't really get to talk about it, but we're going to talk about kind of just UI development overall and like why I got into it. And the short version is basically that, early on in my career, I felt like I learned this lesson that was like, you could have two apps that have the same features and a checklist, but just the UI for one of them makes it a different app. It's like when Trello first came out. It's like we've had this kind of thing before, but the actual interaction and the polish and the way it felt made it a different enough app that it was in a new category. Like it was just because of the UI. All the functionality was the same, quote unquote, but the UI made it way more human and usable. And I feel like that a lot about Apple software and products. And so that's really why I fell in love with UI development. And it did take me a long time as well to even get to notice details. And my one piece of advice there, if you want to get better at details and polish, is, there's going to be a while where your taste is kind of ahead of your skill. So this looks good, but then you go to build it or something like it and you can't do it. But you have enough taste that the people who post it or the people you follow that are good at this, is to just start paying attention to the details, and eventually the skill will catch up. And everyone can do it. Anyone who thinks of themselves not, because I don't have a design background, and I still don't consider, I'm not a designer, but I can make if you look at the UIs I built today versus even a couple years ago, it's like light years difference. And it's just from focusing on the details, paying attention to those small things there. So
I was trying to find it. I can't find the link, so I'll have to look for it later. But there's a talk. Maybe you know what I'm talking about. It's like adding juice to a website. Ooh, have you seen that one?
No.
That's what they call it. But it's like that thing that just adds a little bit more. The first time that I heard about it was on the Syntax podcast, and they were interviewing the guy that created Wordle. And he was talking about how
his name's Wordle, right? Josh Wordle or something like that.
I think so.
Or it's something like that.
Wait, that's your name Josh. For him.
Wordle. Last name is Wordle. Yeah.
See, that's where the name came from. It's not.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, okay, that's where the name came from.
He was talking about how, like, okay, so when you click a button, the technology, the way that computers and code work, it doesn't need to delay. It can just show you the answer right then.
Right.
Like in a split second. You can just have a snap reveal.
Optimistic.
Exactly.
UI.
But he added this juice so that you have the slow reveal to see if you got the letters correctly. And he was talking about just the delight that comes from that. And then that's more of a natural interface, because that's how everything else works in the world.
Totally.
Which is kind of what you're talking about here in terms of like layering those things on. Yes.
And
yes.
Object constancy is something I learned from Mike Bostock from D3, because I used to do a lot of D3 visualization stuff. We're going to have a D3 course on Build UI as well. It's a lot of fun. But that's the idea, where you drag a Trello card, and the fact that it drags and moves with you and everything else animates or whatever, it makes it easier to actually understand, because that's how things work in the real world. And I'm gonna have to watch that talk, because that sounds great.
I'm gonna find it. I'll find it for you.
That's great. And that's like an intentional delay almost, instead of the optimistic UI. They're intentionally adding something to make it feel more realistic.
Yeah.
And if people are interested in this, they should definitely watch the iOS. Was it 14 when they introduced the fluid gesture system, where everything is interruptible and you close apps and switch them with gestures? That talk is amazing, and it hits all of the points that you're talking about. So that's a really, really good one too. And it makes you think. I have this YouTube video where I do the iMessage. I recreate iMessages, and you add and remove messages, and everything shifts instantly, and it's hard to follow. And then you add animation, and it's like, it feels so much better to look at, because you understand how things change. So huge fan of that principle from UI development, for sure.
So I did find it, and you were right.
Oh,
I
nice.
don't know why I didn't make that connection that it's Josh Wardle and Wordle, but
well,
it is
at least
there.
His name, you were right too, though. We were both a little right, a little wrong. His name is not Wordle; it's Wardle.
I didn't even know there was a connection there. But anyways, listen to that episode. It is fantastic. And then I also included a link to the talk, and it's called "Juice It or Lose It."
Oh, nice.
Where they talk about that stuff.
Awesome.
Yep.
Cool.
Are you good? Do you want to go in and pick some plugs?
Yeah, we're right at the hour. It's perfect timing.
So I'll introduce the segment. So for the next segment of the episode, we will do picks and plugs. And this is where we pick something that we like and we plug something generally that we're working on. So Brad, do you have a pick or plug?
I got a pick. One of my nephews got really into Rubik's Cubes over the Thanksgiving break. And so I got one as well. And I've been learning how to solve it. I used to know how to do these in college, but right now I'm at, I know how to do 2 layers, camera, figure it out. And then I've got the top layer, and now I'm just trying to work on the different sides of that top one. It gets more complex as you go.
Right. Are you looking up guides, or are you just doing it by yourself?
I'm 100% looking up guides. Most of it is like, there's specific move sets to get.
Oh, look at that. I feel so left out.
Nice.
I can't do it without a cheat, but I got this one because James is really into it. He can do it like a minute.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So
cool.
we talked about competing. And so I bought a speed cube just so I could I'm super competitive, so I could beat him. And I haven't brought it back up with him because I can't beat him yet.
Okay. This is what we're doing on stage at that conference.
Oh my goodness. So, but anyways, my son got super into it. And so like for his birthday, he turned 9. He wanted a Rubik's Cube themed party.
Whoa.
And so for his birthday, he got like all the variations of the Rubik's Cube. There's like 20 of them. It's crazy.
They get really wild. I can't even imagine solving one of those huge ones.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, but he had a competition at his birthday party and he won.
Yeah.
He won?
All of
Nice.
his friends were like, I don't know. And he's like,
You should just put his hands in the camera, and then you put your head down, and then
a good idea.
James, you can say start, and it'll just.
Oh my goodness! But I'll have like baby hands.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Sweet.
Do you want to plug something?
Plug, I guess, just go check me on Twitter. Start a conversation with me, twitter.com/bradgarropy. Lately, I've just been really into talking about Remix. It's what I've been building with a lot. Syntax highlighting in Markdown has been on my mind lately too.
Nice.
Awesome. Sam, I didn't prep you, but do you have any picks and plugs?
Pick. I just watched Just Friends, which is my favorite Christmas movie, so I'll pick that. It's a great one.
I haven't seen that.
Some people think it's a little immature. Maybe it's because I watched it when I was like younger, but I love it. Ryan Reynolds' delivery in that movie, it just kills me. It is so funny. So
that's awesome.
That's a good one.
Watch it.
I'll pick that. And then plugs, I guess, buildui.com/newsletter. And we're working on a Radix course, and we have 4 other courses right now. So we do one-time prices for our stuff. So you can buy courses or you can just buy lifetime and get everything. So that's kind of how Build Your Eye works. But yeah.
I'm going to have 2 plugs. They're both my picks. But right now I'm in the thick of adventofjs.com and adventofcss.com. So depending on when you're listening to this, it may have already started, but it's still not too late to join. So this year is a little bit different in that we are doing a single project over 24 days. So at the end, you'll have a complete design system library or you'll have a full stack application. And the 2 pieces are kind of working together, but separately. So you can check that out at adventofcss.com or adventofjs.com. And then I'm also going to plug my YouTube channel. So I've been creating more video content. I took a 2-year hiatus and I'm back and trying to regain my monetization status. So, if you just want to play me in the background,
nice.
Feel free. So that's Self-Teach Me.
That's awesome. I'll have to check that out. YouTube is tough. We do YouTube too. It's hard to do it consistently, but I really love YouTube. So
as I've gotten back into it, I'm like, I do love this, and I've missed it, and I forgot that I missed it and how much I enjoyed it.
That's great.
Cool. Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us and talking about all the things UI development. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. That was a blast. Thanks, y'all.
Awesome. Thanks, man. And great talking.
That's all we got.
All right.
So that's goodbye number 1. I love our ending because I'm like, there's no need to come up with a conclusion or a takeaway. Just, there it is.
So good luck washing the rest of your dishes, everybody.
Funny. Okay. And then I don't have control over James's Twitch to be able to raid somebody. So thanks everybody for hanging out in the chat. Appreciate it. I'll go ahead and end the stream.
See you later, Twitch.
See ya.